Hey, what's up, YouTube fans? So, what I want to talk about in this video, right, is how intelligent design, right, is not a plausible starting point, right, for the origin of life, right, or the origin of different groups of living things, right? It is not a plausible starting point, right, from a statistical standpoint, right, without appealing to supernatural concepts which are completely untestable, no independent evidence for their existence whatsoever, and so completely lacking any explanatory power whatsoever, right? So for starters, whatever it is that whatever is the initial starting point for what brings about, life on Earth, right? Uh I think whatever it is, you have to uh invoke the observer bias and a very vast cosmos, right, with us the observers finding ourselves where it happened. That would be applicable even if the first thing were to be a quote unquote intelligent designer, right? Which we don't even really have a clear idea of what that would be. But even if it were to be that, right? Um, without invoking, divine simplicity, supernatural concepts of which are completely untestable, no independent evidence whatsoever, completely lacking explanatory predictive power whatsoever, right? Without invoking that, any intelligent designer is going to, which is capable of producing life, right, is going to itself be extremely improbable to exist from a statistical standpoint. And that applies, even if it has no cause. In fact, even all the more so if it has no cause, right? The fact that it would be as it is from a statistical standpoint extremely improbable, right? Because so without invoking supernatural concepts of which there's no testability, no independent evidence, no explanatory power, right? Intelligent design as we observe it, right, relies on highly complex brain, sensory organs, arms, hands, and the fact that it's not just one individual human on their own, it's billions of us, right? Billions of us collectively, every one of us running on billions of neurons, right? Billions of neurons, every one of us. And there's billions of us working together, right? Um, and so, without relying on supernatural concepts of which we have no independent evidence whatsoever, no testability, no explanatory power, uh, intelligent design, as we actually observe it, is incredibly complex in of itself, right? And so, any designer capable of making life, right, would have to itself be incredibly complex in a way that's statistically unlikely for that thing itself to exist without cause, right? And even all the more so when we consider that if it truly exists without cause, it just always existed without cause, right? That's their typical model for its origin, that it has no cause whatsoever and just always existed. Then that would mean that every atom in its body, in fact, every particle in its body, exists in the right way by chance with no cause of its own, right? And now some of them are going to say, oh, but it's not made out of atoms. Again, I'm going on what we have any testability of, what we have any independent evidence of. If you say it's not even made out of atoms, not made of particles, then you're talking about something we have no testability of whatsoever, no independent evidence of whatsoever, no explanatory power there, therefore, right? And not even really coherence for that matter, not even coherence of a concept, right? Um, And so going on what we do have like independent evidence of testability of, it would have to be made of atoms. And so every atom of its body would have every particle, right, would have to be in the right space from the beginning by chance, right? Because they believe it has no cause of its own, always existed as it is, right? And so, in any event, right, even if that were the initial starting point, we would still, for that to be at all plausible, we would have to say, or at least the best case scenario, we would have to say, which they typically do not say, right, whereas those not agreeing with them would more so say, right, is that this initial thing, exists within, that it was not the only original thing without cause, but that there were many, many, many original things without cause, potentially infinite, arranged in many different ways, most of which random, right? And then that we, the observers, find ourselves wherever it was arranged the right way, right? Ultimately, any way you look at it, right, any initial starting point for it to be, there's really no plausible account for the original first starting thing, other than to say that you have a very vast cosmos, or very vast whatever, many different things, most of which random, right? And us, the observers, finding ourselves where it got started, right? And but so then it comes down to what is the most plausible starting point from a statistical standpoint, right? So you'll want to consider, as I said, right, humans, right, we intelligent design as we observe it, right, it relies on brains, sensory organs, arms, hands, and the fact that there's billions of us humans all working together, right? Every one of us running on billions of neurons, right? Billions of neurons in your brain. And as I said, right, if this thing, right, if this initial thing under their model, right, has no cause, right, then every single individual particle in its structure, right, would have to exist in the right way by chance, right? And then, okay, when we look at, the complexity of life, because obviously, yes, life is itself complex, right? And they want to argue that it's not reducible, right? And yet, really, everything that life itself does across all of life, right, is and to the extent that they would consider irreducible, right, is the same things that whatever the initial thing that started life would have to itself be able to do, right? So, the ability to, for one thing, this intelligent designer, right, would like living organisms, it would have to have the physical ability to make a living thing, right? That's a big part of what uh is one of the greatest abilities of living things is just the fact that they have the physical ability to make more living things, right? And then of course, any intelligent being would have to be able to store information, interpret information, copy information, just as living things do, right? Um, and it would have to be a self-sustaining thing, capable of itself existing, it's self-staying together at least long enough to make a living thing, right? And so, really, all of the fundamental abilities of life, right, that they would consider irreducible, right, that would be necessary, right, uh, are the same things that this intelligent designer would also have to be able to do, right? Um, and when you consider though, right, that anything that's intelligent, any intelligent designer would have to, like living things, be capable of storing information, copying information, uh interpreting information, right? And yet, really, all of that is the bare minimum of intelligence, right? Is the bare minimum, right? And so, rather than having the starting point be something that can do all that humanity can do and more, right? And since they're saying that it exists without a cause, every single part of it, every single particle within it would have to exist in the right way by chance, right? Um, Rather than the starting point being something that can do all that humanity can do and more, right? Uh, Instead, if you have the bare minimum, right, bare minimum starting point, so something capable of copying information, storing information, but to the most mindless extent possible, right? So, like a cell, right? So, unlike, something like a human being, like a cell, right? The most mindless possible uh, way of doing that while still enough sufficient to be able to produce a living organism, so having the physical ability to build it, right? What we're really honing in on then, right, is essentially the more mainstream ideas as to the more scientific models for the origin of life, right? Such as, earlier proto-organisms, right, with simpler genetic systems, right, perhaps based on self-replicating RNA rather than DNA, right? And so, and really, another important point, right, is they really have no model whatsoever as to any of the specifics as to how this thing would itself be structured or how it would work, its mechanisms, right? But to any extent they do, right, really. Um, instead of, having all of the faculties of like a human brain, right? Only the bare minimum, right, capable of producing a living organism, physically capable of it, right? Um, Capable of self-replication, right? Copying, right? But mindless copying, right? And then from there, competition through natural selection, right? Not even all leading in the direction of humans, not always going to humans, going in many, many different directions, right? We see many different directions that life has gone in, right? Which are to a very significant extent random, right? A very large degree of randomness. It does not really need to be as it is, as I've talked about on other videos, right? A bird flies and a bat flies, yet a bat in every system of its body is vastly more like a camel, a elephant, a seal, a human, a mouse. The whole difference between mammal and they live in most of the same environments, bats and birds. The whole difference between a mammal and a bird, right, is from a practical standpoint not necessary and yet predicted based on which groups we are part of, predicted based on the patterns predicted by common descent, right? Going all the way down to the molecular level and the embryonic level, right? And so, I mean, they want to say that it's kind of contradictory when they're wanting to say that the basics of life, the cellular machinery shared by all life, that it's irreducible, and yet they're wanting to say that a God could be simpler than life and still be able to make life, right? Then it isn't irreducible, right? If you could have something simpler, capable of physically capable of building a living organism, capable of storing information, copying information, which any intelligent thing would have to be able to do, right? And why go beyond that? Why go beyond the basics, right? When we really, from a statistical standpoint, you would want to go with the minimum threshold, right? In the, keeping in mind, though, that anything at the initial starting point is going to be very statistically unlikely, right? And then ultimately what it comes back to is a very vast cosmos, right? And the fact that we, the observers, can only find ourselves wherever it happened, right? And so, and yes, as I acknowledged on the video, many of them will want to have the divine simplicity concept of God, where he's not made of parts. They'll want appeal to supernatural concepts, but in that case, we there's no testability of that, no independent evidence whatsoever of it as a mechanism, right? And so no explanatory power whatsoever, right? And so, and so that's all for now. See you guys.